One of Malaysia's economic problems as of late is the country's national debt. Here's a graph with data that we collected from the International Monetary Fund on the general government gross debt as a percentage of GDP of Malaysia. This is an indicator that measures the total outstanding debt of the central, state, and local governments relative to the country's gross domestic product. As you can see from the graph, Malaysia's general government gross debt has been rising since the start of the 21st century. Back in 2000, the percentage to GDP was just 32.5%, yet by 2023, it has risen to over 69.8%. This rise in government debt has then led many to believe that Malaysia's economy is in trouble. Government debt, after all, is often cited in many articles and scientific journals about its harms in one's economy. On top of the government debt issue, many articles have been talking about the tremendous rise in Malaysia's household debt. Some articles said that Malaysia's household debt has risen to over 1.53 trillion Malaysian ringgit in 2023, which, as a percentage of GDP, was over 84.2%. This raises the question, how is Malaysia going to fix this? Does current Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim even have a plan to reduce the debt that Malaysia has? Well, fortunately, yes. Prime Minister Anwar does have a plan, along with his administration, to fix these problems in Malaysia. Let's first start with the government debt of Malaysia, as it is the most important one that Anwar needs to fix. Malaysia's general government gross debt to GDP, as we mentioned earlier, now stands at over 69.8%, which comparatively is actually one of the highest in Southeast Asia. It is higher than Thailand's debt, Indonesia's debt, Vietnam's debt, the Philippines' debt, and only below that of Singapore and Laos. However, comparing Singapore's debt might not truly tell the entire story, as the island nation is often known as a unique case where government debt is largely offset by substantial national savings and assets. Therefore, one can easily see just how big Malaysia's debt is. So, how did we get here? Well, there are two factors here. The first is because of the recent COVID-19 pandemic, and the second is due to fiscal deficits, both of which are intertwined. Let's first talk about the COVID-19 pandemic that has led many governments globally, including Malaysia, to borrow heavy amounts of money to stimulate its economy. Here's a table of Malaysia's federal government position from 2015 to 2025. As you can see from the table right here, there are two important factors here to understand: revenues and expenditures. This is basically how a government collects money from taxes and spends money for things like infrastructure programs, the military, the police, and so on. As you can see from the table, the government has been spending more money than they are collecting from taxes or revenues. From 2015 to 2019, the overall balance to GDP was just around -3%. But as the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the overall balance had increased the deficit to over -6.2% in 2020, and further deficit spending in the coming years. This is what led to Malaysia's debt to rise, as the government was borrowing heavily to stimulate their economies, whilst their GDP wasn't rising as fast as the rate of borrowing. This is what Anwar has been trying to fix, by lowering the expenditures and increasing the revenues. Hence, as you can see from the table right here, the overall balance has been dropping since Anwar came into office in late 2022. In 2023, the overall balance was reduced to a -5%, then further to -4.4%, and then, as expected, in the budget 2025, to just 3.8%. This reduction in the overall balance, especially in the expected budget of 2025, is a reflection of Anwar's good fiscal management. But a lot of people aren't happy with what he has done to achieve this. Why? Well, among the many factors out there that led to this reduction. What we found to be amongst the most important ones are the increase in revenues and the reduction in expenditures. What this means can be understood through taxes. Prime Minister Anwar, since coming into office, has introduced various taxes to the Malaysian people. He has introduced taxes in luxury goods tax, dividend income tax, capital gains tax, sugar-sweetened beverages tax, sales and services tax, SST, expansion, and so on. Most of these taxes, however, as you can clearly see, are either directed towards the wealthy or as a form of sin tax. The luxury goods, dividend income, and capital gain tax are targeting wealthier people, as most of these taxes are designed to ensure that the wealthiest segments of society contribute a fair share to Malaysia's revenue. To top off the increased taxes on the wealthy, these would also help reduce the inequality of Malaysia, as Anwar has been implementing targeted subsidies to the poor. If you actually listened closely, you can see where this is going. Anwar is basically trying to tax the rich to help increase the government revenues, money that will be used to reduce the fiscal deficit and help alleviate debt burdens. Now, it is also important to know that while taxes are on the rise for some Malaysians, this is in fact still low compared to many other economies out there. Here's a graph on the tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, with data that we collected from the World Bank and the Ministry of Finance of Malaysia. As you can see, the tax to GDP of Malaysia for the latest year sits at only 12.6%. Just compare that to the Philippines, Thailand, and Singapore, 3 countries with higher tax revenues to GDP than Malaysia. What this essentially means is that Malaysia's government collects a relatively smaller portion of its economic output in taxes compared to its regional neighbours. Put simply, Malaysia just doesn't tax that much, and by raising the taxes by a few percentage points may not even be enough for Malaysia to be on par with other major economies out there. Secondly, what Anwar has done to fix the fiscal deficit problem is by reducing subsidies. Here's a graph on the subsidies, incentives, and assistance in Malaysia by billions of ringgit. As you can see, the subsidies have been falling. This is one of the ways Malaysia has been cutting their expenditures as subsidies have gotten too much. And this is also where Anwar has been getting unfavourable public attention. Some people are saying that he has not only been increasing taxes, but he has also been cutting subsidies. What you should know, however, is that he is doing this both because he has to reduce the fiscal deficit, as well as to stop giving subsidies to everyone, but rather only target the ones who really need it the most. This is again one of the ways Anwar is trying to reduce all these inequality that Malaysia is experiencing. He is trying to raise the taxes on the wealthy and cut subsidies to them, and then focus on the vulnerable people. Finally, it is also important to know that while Malaysia's debt has been high, as of late, it's mostly actually borrowed domestically. Here's a table with data that we collected from the Ministry of Finance of Malaysia. As you can see, the debt to GDP of Malaysia is mostly held domestically, as the latest data available for the first quarter of 2024 shows that over 97.5% of all the federal government debt of Malaysia is domestic, with only 2.5% of the total held in overseas borrowings. To top it off, Malaysia's debt to GDP in this federal government data has actually been going down. As you can see here in the graph, the debt to GDP in 2021 was 63.3%, whereas, in the latest data available, it is just 62.6%. Although it's a small decline, it is important to know that the GDP of Malaysia has steadily risen as seen in the graph from 1.5 trillion ringgit in 2021 to over 1.9 trillion ringgit by the first quarter of 2024. Some of you may already know why domestic debt isn't bad, but for those of you who don't know, it's simply because domestic debt is generally less risky than foreign debt. When a country borrows domestically, it owes money to its own citizens or institutions, which keeps the debt within the local economy. The government can manage this debt more flexibly since repayments are made in the local currency that it can print in its own central bank. This ability to issue its own currency gives the government more control over its financial obligations compared to foreign debt, which must be repaid in foreign currencies like the US dollar or euro. Now, let's talk about the household debt of Malaysia and how Anwar is trying to fix it. Here's a table of the composition of Malaysia's household debt for 2023. As you can see, 60.5% of it is from housing loans, followed by vehicle loans at 13.2%, and then personal financing at 12.6%, with the remaining spread out on things like credit card and security. So, how is he trying to fix the household debt? Well, unlike government debt, household debt is much more trickier to fix. Some of the things he has done so far are the likes of increasing financial literacy to help Malaysians make better financial decisions, which may not really be the answer to reducing the overall household debt. But what also stands true is that Malaysia's interest rates may soon fall. Currently, it's still at 3%, as you can see in the graph right here. What led to this rise is due to the recent inflation that Malaysia and the world saw. But as inflation has now gone down, it is likely that the interest rate would also drop. What this means for the household debt of Malaysia is that lower interest rates could alleviate some of the financial pressure on households. When interest rates fall, the cost of borrowing decreases, making it easier for individuals to service their loans. This could provide much-needed relief for Malaysian households, particularly those with high levels of debt tied to housing loans, personal loans, and credit card debt. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.